So we have a number of people joining us from overseas and elsewhere, but I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this main part of the session is being held, the Whadjuk people, and pay their respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This is the 7th instalment of our Automation Cultures seminar series, which began last year in 2021. The series runs alongside the ARC Discovery Project on the cultural and intellectual history of automated labour, supported by the Australian Research Council, the University of Western Australia, Symbiotica, and also involving the University of Queensland. So we've had speakers from around the world and around Australia join us for this series, and we're pleased to welcome another distinguished speaker today, Chris Danta. So Chris is an ARC Future Fellow and Professor of English at UNSW. He's had a long interest in how literature registered the rise of the biological sciences in the late 19th century, and how our conception of the relationship between the human and the animal, and now also the machine, was shaped through and in the literary imagination. So Chris has written on Kafka and Kierkegaard, but also his latest book examined the post-Darwinian animal fable. So he's interested in literary forms and how these sort of ideas, both concepts, ideas, and self-knowledge, impacted the actual shape of literature and vice versa. So the genre and metaphor and speciesism thing all bound up with that recent book. Today we're hearing about some of his new work that extends to literary ideas about the coevolution of the human and the machine. And we're also lucky to be joined today by Matthew Chirlew, who will provide a formal response to Chris's talk before we open then to general discussion. So Matt is Senior Research Fellow at the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry at Curtin University, who's also written on the relationship between biology and literature, particularly lately on stories of extinction. So we'll hear first from Chris, and then from Matt. So please join me in welcoming both.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that lovely introduction and for organising this amazing trip. And thanks very much to Chris too for all his help with the administration of it. And yeah, thanks so much for coming along. I'm really excited to be here. That was a really nice introduction. You sort of have a bit of a sense of what I do now. I thought I might have to introduce myself, as a literary scholar, and I'm interested in storytelling, and I wanted to, in this paper, it's a kind of unusual paper. I find it's sort of quite experimental for what I do, sort of trying to push things in certain directions, because it's really the beginning of this project I'm doing. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the Future Fellowship. And so I think what I'm doing a little bit is feeling my way through things with the project. So this is stuff that could potentially be, part of the introduction to the new book that I'd be writing, based on the Future Fellowship. And you can see from the title, I've got this interest in non-human perspective. And I sort of want to talk about how literary and science writers use non-human perspective, invoke non-human perspective in order to sort of think about what it means to be human, sort of critique anthropocentrism, that kind of thing, which is, if you know animal studies, a very kind of standard move within literary animal studies and critical animal studies. The other part, evolutionary thinking, I'm sort of really interested in the paper in talking about how sort of we've thought about machines in this kind of evolutionary way. So the evolution of machines, sort of happens pretty much immediately after Darwin. People are there going, well, maybe machines evolved too, and they're sort of alive and evolving. So that's sort of where the paper's coming from. So just to Sarah's already sort of talked a bit about this, but I'm meant to be working on this Future Fellowship, and it's called Future Fables, Literature, Evolution, and Artificial Intelligence. And it's really just trying to tell that story of when people started thinking about, after Darwin, machines evolving, how did we start telling stories about that? How did we start to think about it? And I think in this paper, something that's really interesting me is this idea, I guess I'd call it speculative anthropology. So people are speculating about machines and about machines being alive, machines evolving, in order to think about what it means to be human. So it's sort of speculative in the sense of the object of sort of investigation is kind of speculative, like the machine, what's going on in there, is it alive, is it evolving? And I mean, in the slide I've just got, I argue that the fable is a literary story type that can be used anthropologically. So I'm interested in, so Sarah mentioned I wrote this book called Animal Fables After Darwin, how writers after Darwin used what I would call the sort of form of the fable to rethink what it means to be human. Once that we think the human is an animal, then stories involving animals sort of strike us differently, don't they? It's a very simple point, but, we can sort of see ourselves in that kind of evolutionary way. And then it's a way of critiquing sort of human anthropocentrism, through this sort of form of the fable. And this idea of non-human perspective is very important in this idea of the fable. Fables give us non-human perspectives. Part of the project is I don't actually talk about anthropomorphism here, but rethinking what anthropomorphism could do, thinking of it in a productive way. Normally, people are very critical of it. So, how can you adopt the perspective of an animal? How can you adopt the perspective of anything? Because you're human. But we can actually, I think, use this concept to open up a sort of way of thinking about the other. So anthropomorphism can be productive in that way. So that's sort of where the work is sort of heading with this concept of anthropomorphism. But yeah, I'm just really interested in this idea. I mean, I call it here a conceptual metaphor that machines are alive. So, one of the ways in the slide I've got, one of the ways in which humans understand their relationship to technology is by analogy to biological processes. So it's really interesting, that analogy, isn't it? So if there's biological evolution, could there be mechanical evolution, machinic evolution? So we think of machines as somehow being alive and as somehow evolving over time. And this is what I mean about it being speculative. I mean, we have no idea, do we? It's just a kind of a thought experiment in a way. So as I've mentioned, I just want to try to trace some of the history of this incorporation of the machine into the biological imagination and examine some of the speculative rhetorical techniques it enables. So, both literary and scientific writers, and I mean, this is something I want to talk about today. I don't know how to do it, but I'm interested in thinking about, I'm obviously on the side of literature, and it's very easy for someone trained in literary, criticism to talk about literature and how all these things work in literature. But I'm actually interested in proposing, well, I want to look at some science writers. I don't know what to call them, people not, non-literary writers, people working in other fields, and how they're using literary techniques, and how does that, can we actually acknowledge that and sort of analyze that in a way? And people in my field might say, well, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just look at the literature or something? But I think it's interesting to try to go across fields like that. And this is a starting point. I've got Philip K. Dick uses this metaphor of machines being alive in this crazy speech he gave to the 1972 Vancouver Science Fiction Convention. I've had to sort of edit it because he's so inappropriate at moments. You realize how much things have changed since then. But this is one of his starting points. In the last decade, our environment, and you might not be able to see this, can you see it? It's very small. Our environment, and I mean our man-made world of machines, artificial constructs, computers, electronic systems, linking homeostatic components, all this is in fact beginning more and more to possess animation. In a very real sense, our environment is becoming alive, or at least quasi-alive, in ways specifically and fundamentally analogous to ourselves. So here we have machines are alive and the problem of analogy. And what interests me here is this, I guess, idea of a collective agent that is being invoked. What Dick imagines coming to life is not an individual machine, but rather machines in general. Sort of, machines as a kind of technological background. So I'm really interested in that. I'll talk a bit later about the difference between background and foreground, the idea that human society is in the foreground and we have things in the background that we often don't notice. And that's the idea of the background, almost a technological environment coming to life. And I'm just wondering, is this something new? Because, there's a long tradition of stories of things coming to life, machines coming to life. I've just mentioned some here, Pinocchio, Frankenstein's creature, the golem, the myth of the golem, Galatea, the Greek robot Talus. There are all these, stories, but they're all sort of, pretty much involve, small scale, like an individual thing coming to life and sort of following that perspective. Is it different to say, well, what happens if we think of everything, animistically as kind of being alive? Does that change things? And this is Dick again. Perhaps really what we're seeing is a gradual merging of the general nature of human activity and function into the activity and function of what we humans have built and surround ourselves with. 100 years ago, such a thought would have been absurd rather than merely anthropomorphic. What could a man living in 1750, I sort of wondered if he actually means 1850 here, have learned about himself by observing the behavior of a donkey steam engine. I was trying to look up when the donkey steam engine came out. It's a bit later than that. But so he's sort of seeing this is kind of as historically unprecedented, this kind of age of computers where things, you know, we have a sense of the technological environment as being alive. But I mean, I think he's wrong about this. And this is the project. My project would be sort of trying to demonstrate this in a way, because there are already people in the 19th century who, you know, they're not thinking about computers and electronic systems. They're thinking about machines, but machines being alive. And so, you know, some of the starting points of my project are and the English writer Samuel Butler, George Eliot, the English writer George Eliot, who comes, you know, writes a bit later. And I look at one of her examples from a book of hers at the end. And they were thinking of machines as, you know, as being vital. And they were seeing this as problematizing the distinction between human and machine, you know, sort of getting us to rethink our identity. So, and here's an example of what I'm talking about with speculative anthropology. So, you know, Butler's novel just happens to come out 100 years before Dick's speech, and in this novel, he kind of does what I would describe as a kind of project of speculative anthropology. This is actually a footnote. It's sort of really weird. It's a novel, but the unnamed narrator kind of makes a footnote, and this is what he says in the footnote. He's going to go back to England and kind of talk to people about what their attitudes to machines being alive are, you know. And so it's kind of like a speculative anthropological project. So since my return to England, I've been told that those who are conversant about machines use many terms concerning them which show that their vitality is here recognized, and the collection of expressions in use amongst those attend on steam engines would be no less startling than instructive. I'm also informed that almost all machines have their own tricks and idiosyncrasies, that they know their drivers and keepers, and that they play pranks upon a stranger. It is my intention, as on a future occasion, to bring together these examples, both of the expressions in common use among mechanicians and of any extraordinary exhibitions of mechanical sagacity and eccentricity that I can meet with, not as believing in the Erewhonian professor's theory, but from interest in the subject. So, you know, sort of this idea that, you know, anthropomorphism, if you take it to the extreme, is going, well, maybe these things are alive and we're not, you know, just projecting onto them, but, you know, we can actually think about them and think about what our attitudes towards them being alive are. And, you know, the book, you know, I won't sort of go through it, is, you know, involves this trip to this land of Erewhons, of nowhere backwards, kind of with a bit of rearrangement. So it's a kind of utopian novel. And the Erewhonian professor is essentially someone who goes, we should be terrified because machines are evolving and we've got to, you know, destroy them all. So this is what they do in Erewhon. They destroy all the machines, and so that they don't evolve and take over, you know, so there's been this war. And but what's interesting is, you know, in order to convince people that machines are alive, he's got to come up with these amazing arguments about how they are alive. So I find reading this book really strange, because in this tract that's meant to be saying let's destroy all machines, this sort of anti-machinist professor, there are all these reasons for thinking machines are alive, right? So, and these of course are Butler's views as well. So Butler's just kind of expressing himself through this. So he says, this is the professor, let anyone examine the wonderful self-regulating and self-adjusting contrivances which are now incorporated with the vapor engine. Let him watch the way in which it supplies itself with oil, in which it indicates its wants to those who tend it, in which by the governor it regulates the application of its own strength. Let him look at the storehouse and inertia and motion, momentum, the flywheel. Look at that storehouse of emotion and inertia and momentum, the flywheel, or the buffers on a railway carriage. Let him see how these improvements are being selected for perpetuity. So there's this use of Darwinian language, which contain provision against emergencies that may arise to harass machines, and then let him think of 100,000 years and of and the accumulated progress which will bring unless man can be awakened to a sense of his situation, one of the doom which he is preparing himself for. It's so small that I'm having trouble reading it from here. So that's why I like the pictures. I'm sort of, you know, I'm using that you know, the sort of designer function. It's sort of, it looks better than what I could come up with on my own.
Can we interject?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
My reading of Butler's book and his original Darwin Among the Machine kind of letter to the editor that he did, he was anti-Darwinist. So that was really trying to make it so ridiculous that people won't believe in Darwinism, rather than try to convince us that there's evolution, technological evolution. Because the whole book is really about kind of an upside-down world, in the sense, you know, because there's the pre-life as opposed to afterlife, there's the sick people in prisons and prisoners in hospitals. So the whole setup of the book is really to show that Darwinian evolution doesn't work.
Yeah, but I think what I sort of wrote, I've got an article that I quote, you know, that I've written, where I think if you look at what he's saying and elsewhere, he's actually does sort of believe in it because he's kind of animistic. I'll take you to this quote here. Where is it? A bit later? Yeah, here that down the bottom he says he writes in this evolutionary text, Luck or Cunning, the theory that living beings are conscious machines can be fought just as much and just as little as the theory that machines are unconscious living beings. Everything that goes to prove either of these propositions goes just as well to prove the other also. So there's a sense in which he thinks
So he convinced himself by satirizing it.
Yeah. I think my argument would be he started in a satirical mode, but then he actually took it literally and goes, hang on, that's actually, I was onto something. So that's my argument. Yeah. So I've written a piece on him as a panpsychist. Panpsychism is this idea that everything has a mind, everything, sort of an animistic belief. And he's clearly says direct things like that's what I think is right. So that's why I think it's interesting. So like, this is what I'm saying, this analogy, like it'd be a good way to put the problem, this analogy go, well, that's a bit of a laugh, isn't it? He even wrote to Darwin saying, look, I hope you're not offended. I didn't mean anything. But he also, they fell out and he, I think he realized that he did mean it. And, and that's why people were taking offense. So this is the whole thing of, analogy can be difficult, isn't it? So you draw something and you sort of go, well, it's not too serious, but then hang on, what happens if we do take it seriously? And then if that becomes a belief, then it becomes complicated, doesn't it? So that's my take on what's happening. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. It sort of helped me to, it helps me to explain. So, this is, we've sort of covered some of this. I mean, he's the first one to sort of propose this. And I mean, I haven't found anyone earlier. He seems to be, if you look at, Origin of Species, 1859. He's very quickly, he writes this essay when he's, I find it interesting, this sort of idea of periphery. He's sort of in New Zealand running a sheep farm. So I find it interesting that he's on the edge of the world and he comes up with this idea that sort of really now has become so central. It's like he is critiquing the centre by doing this from New Zealand. And and he says, he says things which we could, take the the error-wanting professor to be saying, if we revert to the earliest primordial types of mechanical life, to the lever, the wedge, the inclined plane, the screw, the pulley, or for analogy, would lead us one step further to that one primordial type from which all mechanical kingdom has developed. We mean the lever itself. And if we then examine the machinery of the Great Eastern, it's a huge ship, we find ourselves almost awestruck by at the vast development of the mechanical world, or the gigantic strides with which it has advanced in comparison with the slow progress of the animal and vegetable kingdom. So this idea that, if you give machines long enough, they've come so far. And if you also sort of have to assume, well, it doesn't matter that we've made them, they can sort of take control of themselves eventually. We're sort of like the sort of nursemaids, whatever, of these machines. What's the word? Someone who helps give birth. Midwife. Yeah, that's it. Sorry, that was a silly thing. And then one of these. So what I'm seeing as a storytelling technique here is this idea of what happens if you put things in evolutionary time. So if you give things thousands of years, and so what he does in the text is sort of we'll go back to the beginning of the planet and say, well, we took so long to evolve, like, well, what happens if we imagine thousands of years in the future? So for me, that's a kind of speculative evolutionary aesthetic approach where you just sort of put things in a huge timescale and then you can tell stories of machines coming to life. So he's sort of, doing something, this analogy, applying something that's usually reserved for the natural order and imagining and eventually surpassing us. And so he's, the starting point for a project where you go, well, why are we worried the machines might take over? I mean, Butler was saying this, in the 1860s, 1870s. So he's very much the start of that, this kind of Elon Musk paranoid sort of approach to machines. He says, we'll become the inferior. We'll become inferior in power, inferior in the moral quality of self-control. We shall look up to them as the acme of all that's best and wisest, wisest men can ever dare to aim at. As we've sort of talked about before. So I'm just sort of going, well, if you start with Dick, I mean, here's a man who is in the 19th century going, we can learn something about ourselves by looking at machines. And I'm interested in what does that anthropological project look like? And that's, it's very sort of, my ideas on it are very incipient. Just to jump forward to today, I mean, this is the idea that machines are alive is currently gaining traction outside of literature in the field of computer science. So there are lots of people now saying, well, this is happening for real, and the sort of coming from the perspective of science. It's not just a story, it's not just fiction, it's sort of happening. And this is why I've become interested in computer scientist Edward Abbott Lee's book, The Coevolution. So this came out a few years ago, The Entwined Futures of Humans and Machines. And he starts talking about, he doesn't talk about analogy here, but he talks about metaphor. So it's the same problem. What is this metaphor doing? Machines are alive. And so it's very small again. In my own exploration of the relationship between humans and the machines, I found it useful to think of machines as having a life of their own, sharing our ecosystem and co-evolving with us. To consider them living, in inverted commas, is not to consider them intelligent, nor to assign them agency, but rather to understand that they have a certain autonomy and ability to sustain their own processes and ability to replicate themselves, mostly with our help for now. The metaphor forces to the foreground doubts about the extent to which we can control the trajectory of technology, and lends insight into other forces besides the force that will affect this trajectory. So just sort of thinking about this metaphor. And I think something that he's very clear about is that it's, you've used the word heuristic, it's useful. So it helps us to think about ourselves, to think about machines being alive. So he could say, we could debate forever whether to consider digital technology to be living, but the debate would be pointless. The more interesting question is this: can the metaphor help us to understand better what is happening to us humans and our society? So it's sort of then, this is what I'm seeing is inaugurating this kind of anthropological sort of project. Something I find when you read a lot of writing about technology, it's always about, well, is it going to happen? And what does a living machine look like? Or what does a transhuman subject look like? It's all about sort of almost like the end result. I think what's interesting about a kind of more literary approach is there's a kind of scene before, isn't there? It's like, well, what happens if we imagine us before a machine thinking, well, are you alive? Could it happen? And like the scene of, say, Frankenstein before his creature, like what's going on? And literature, this creates storytelling, doesn't it? So you sort of tell stories about what this scene. So it's almost like I feel like going too fast, too quickly to sort of say, well, this is what society is going to look like when machines are living and so on. There's actually this kind of sort of primal scene to start with. This is a very cute, I quite like this. He coins this phrase, LDBs. This is Lee, for living digital beings. It's a sort of a shorthand. And he actually says in the book, and I've seen him talk as well about it, he says his publisher got him to sort of get rid of the phrase as much as he could from the book, because it just wouldn't, like people would be put off by this. But I find it interesting. So he clearly, what I find interesting, he clearly wanted to go further with it, but he wasn't allowed to by his publisher. So it's kind of interesting. So the point, I think, is he's not sort of insisting that machines are living and in what way they're living. He's just saying it can help us to reflect. So that's sort of the end of that sort of first part, sort of about the sort of historical dimension of sort of evolutionary thinking about the machine. And I've just sort of tried to suggest, I guess, that it kind of enables a kind of speculative anthropology. And I don't know, I'm sort of coming up with all these things which I don't know how to fill these kind of terms of what speculative anthropology is exactly. Thinking about technology as living and as evolving helps Dick, Butler, and Lee to speculate about what is happening to the human in their specific historical moment. And, it'll be different. Like it's a sort of, I'm not suggesting there's a kind of homogeny to what they're concluding. It's just sort of at each of these historical moments, they're coming up with different ideas. So Dick, for example, I find his essay almost quite paranoid. He says, well, we're becoming more inanimate. So as machines become more animate, we're becoming more inanimate, and that's terrible. And so his essay is kind of reaction. They're going, well, what's uniquely human? He kind of gets very defensive and goes, well, we have to come up with what's uniquely human, otherwise we're going to lose it all to the machines. And so
was that before he became Christian?
I don't know. When was that? Yeah.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, this is.
He was born again, and I suppose
maybe.
The mindset.
Yeah. As I say, this is from that essay, the 1972 essay. So it's interesting. So and he sort of so he's often, we associate him with these kind of living, the sort of androids, but he's very sort of paranoid about the idea as well. So he says, here is a thought not too pleasing. As the external world becomes more animate, we may find that we, the so-called humans, are becoming and may, to a great extent, always have been inanimate, in the sense that we're led, directed, and by built-in tropisms rather than leading. So we and our elaborately evolving computers may meet each other halfway. Someday, a human being named perhaps Fred White may shoot a robot named Pete something or other, which has come out of a General Electric's factory, and to his surprise, see it weep and bleed. And the dying robot may shoot back, and to its surprise, see a wisp of grey smoke arise from the electric pump that was supposed to be Fred's White's beating heart. It would be rather a great moment for it would be rather a great moment of truth for both of them. It's just this kind of complete reversal, isn't it? It's very, and he actually, I've sort of got there. He's, if you've read his 1969 story, The Electric Ant, it kind of tells that story. This guy Garson Poole wakes up. He's been in an accident, and he's hands getting reattached, and the doctor says, "You're actually a robot." And he goes, "Oh my God," he thought he was real, human anyway. And it sort of tells the story of him coming to the horror of him coming to terms with that. So what I'm trying to do, I guess, in the project is you can plug it into then moments of the history of speculative literature and examples of speculative literature. These next two slides, this is the sort of core of maybe the theoretical part of the paper, and so the most contentious maybe. To attribute life to the machines that surround us, as Dick does in Androids and Humans, is in some sense to attribute a point of view and subjecthood to our technological environment. Thinking machines as living allows the writer to adopt the point of view or subject position of a specific machine or group of machines within the animate technological environment. The point of view of this machine or group of machines is at once individual, I would say, and collective. Individual in the sense that the machine is located somewhere in time and space. Collective in the sense that the machine represents a perspective of the non-human environment itself. So that's what I'm interested in. Is he, by invoking the idea that machines are alive, saying, well, we can look at ourselves from the perspective of the environment, not a particular perspective, but a sort of more general perspective. So in part two, I want to examine how literary and science writers use this technique of collective non-human perspective to speculate about the future of AI. And I found this helpful. This is from Catherine Hale. She says, the way to escape anthropocentrism is precisely through an imaginative projection into the worldviews of other objects and beings based on evidence about their ways of being in the world, although with the important caveat that these are analogies and should not be mistaken for an object's own experience. See how often that word analogy comes up? It's analogy, metaphor, it's all very loose. And she calls this speculative aesthetics. And this is the essay I was talking about that I've written, Panpsychism and Speculative Evolutionary Aesthetics in Samuel Butler's The Book of the Machines. But I'm wondering, she's very much concerned, I think, with the idea of adopting an individual perspective. I'm saying, what happens if we see it as more general, nonetheless? She's trying to safeguard that approach by saying, if you stick to good knowledge about that individual perspective, then you'll be safe. But, I'm saying there's still a general dimension that she can't escape from there, environmental kind of thinking. So I want to analyze, writers trying to escape anthropocentrism through imaginative projection into the worldview, not just of a technological object, but also of the technological environment. I'm saying, is there this other dimension involved here, not just an individual perspective, but a more general one? Literary critic Martin Puchner has recently argued that, in this era of climate change, we need stories with collective agents. So I'm wondering, can we come up with stories of collective agents through this kind of approach? My hypothesis is that by invoking the point of view of a collective non-human agent, speculative anthropologies of the human-machine relation, like those of Dick, Butler, and Lee, embody a type of environmental thinking. Again, I don't have much more to say about that, except maybe, is this what's happening? I'm really at the early stages. So let me just have a look at these three examples. Hopefully I've got time. Is that right? I've got about 28 minutes. Is that how long I've been going for? Yeah. So yeah, I've got a few. I think I should be able to get to the end. So this is Ashford Lee and Edward Ashford Lee. He says, you, dear reader, may even be yourself an artificial intelligence. There are quite a few AI programs out there that voraciously read every text available and use the text to refine their own artificial neural net. If you're an AI, then I apologize in advance for my speciesism as an author. I will continue, perhaps inadvertently, to address my readers under the assumption that they are all human. Yet I know at an intellectual level that some of you are not. That's in some sense a very simple, it's almost like a joke he makes in the book, I think. But I've sort of done the Samuel Butler thing, maybe, of taking it too seriously. And I want to just analyze it as an example of apostrophe, which is a literary, it's a very common figure in literature and poetry. It's a figure of speech by which a speaker or writer suddenly stops in his discourse and turns to address pointedly some personal thing, either present or absent. So the idea is that he's addressing human readers, and then suddenly he stops and starts addressing, AI readers, non-human readers. And literary critic Barbara Johnson's written this great book called Persons and Things. She says apostrophe is an act of animation that allows the writer to transform an I-it relationship, human-machine, into an I-thou relationship, thus making a relation between persons out of what was in fact a relation between persons and non-persons. So it's a figure of personification, anthropomorphism. So by imagining that AI programs are reading his book, Lee turns these programs into potential interlocutors in his argument. What I find very interesting, though, is they don't say anything. So that's part of the effect, isn't it? He invokes that perspective without actually filling it with anything. This is where I start to think about this relation between foreground and background. I find it interesting if we imagine the AI machines being part of our sort of environmental background. What interests me about Lee's apostrophe is that it attempts to escape anthropocentrism by speculatively imbuing the technological environment surrounding the human with the point of view. As Johnson notes, apostrophe brings the whole surrounding world into the speech event. Lee's apostrophe brings the whole surrounding world of technology into the speech event. So he's kind of bringing technology into the foreground. It has the effect of drawing something that is in the perceptual background of Lee's human readers, the AI systems that are refining their artificial neural nets by reading human-authored books, into the perceptual foreground. Momentarily, these AI programs stop being unnoticed things in the background of human perception and instead become subjects in the foreground that Lee addresses in the second person as you. So part of my idea with this type of storytelling is that it draws our attention to things that we don't normally pay attention to. So, you know, fables do this with animals, but they can do it with machines. Literature can do it with machines. So reorients a human to the sort of perceptual background. The apostrophe disorients and unsettles human readers because it presents AI programs as being both like us, a reader of text, and radically different from us. So it almost allows these two endpoints, like you can sort of see machines as just totally non-human almost, or quite like us, being human. You know, if AI programs reading human books, then how might they interpret them? If a machine can read and interpret human authored books, then what is the difference between human and machine? You know, we can sort of start asking these questions based on this thought experiment. And as I just mentioned, it's making it unsettling is the fact that we don't hear the AI, you know, program saying anything. That perspective is invoked. And it's also a collective perspective. It's not a particular reader. He's thinking it's just any program that's reading. And you know, you can sort of take it to a kind of absurd level and kind of think, well, there's a sort of something elegiac here, because imagine what happens if machines outlive us, and you can imagine machines being able to read human-authored books even when we're not there. Okay, so because they're connected to the net, if things are still working in that way. And so it sort of allows us to imagine this kind of post-apocalyptic scenario. And there's a book that I'm intending to write on for this project, Roger Zelazny's 1966 novella For a Breath I Tarry. After humans have died out, the sentient machine Frost reads human-authored books to teach himself what it means to be human, and eventually he achieves the goal of becoming human. So there's a kind of circular type of story you can tell, where you go, like, humans invent robots, die out, machines die out, machines rediscover what it means to be human and become human. So that you can imagine it in a circular way, or you can just imagine it more in a linear way of, like, we go, there's something totally different, and that's the end of you know, of us. So I'm interested in those kind of different story possibilities that are allowed for. This is another writer I've discovered recently, Bo-Young Kim, a South Korean science fiction writer who wrote 2 stories on the origin of species and on the origin of species and what might have happened thereafter. They came out in English in 2021. I haven't been able to work out yet when they were first written. I think it might be 2006 or so. And they present a variation on this theme. In the stories, the robot character Kay learns how to recreate biological life in the lab after it's gone extinct on Earth because of an environmental catastrophe. So she does a PhD and sort of discovers life. You know, she works out there was something before, there was like atmosphere, and she recreates it, and then biological creatures emerge, and then she goes, they're so dangerous, you know, they're going to kill us, and then she actually tries to kill them all. So yeah, it's a fun, you know, it sounds sort of dark, but it's quite fun. Yeah, so this is what I mean. I'm just wondering, is there a kind of environmental thinking here going on? You know, where the sort of the technological environment comes to life, and then we sort of see it from that sort of point of view. I'm trying to move on really quickly. Like, you know, Genevieve Bell, an Australian anthropologist, she wrote an interesting essay called "Talking to AI: An Anthropological Encounter with Artificial Intelligence," and she here proposes the idea of interviewing the first conference on AI, you know, the 1956 Dartmouth Summer Research Project on artificial intelligence. This is when that sort of term became, you know, I think was proposed and sort of the field kind of was developed. You know, John McCarthy was the organizer of that event. It's interesting. She goes, I wonder if the ethnographic interview, a la James Bradley, would be a generative anthropological way to approach AI. Of course, there is a challenge of how to conduct an interview with such a subject. After all, there are no obvious AI that I could interview. So this would be an exercise in developing the questions and attempting to articulate a range of possible speculative answers. So speculative anthropology, again, is her approach. It also means picking an AI for as much as the name might suggest. AI is not singular, but rather a multiplicity. Put another way, there are many different AIs, not just one. For the sake of this speculative ethnographic interview, you know, she proposes the Dartmouth conference. And these are the questions she asks. I won't spend much time on this. What is your name? What do you do every day? What do you dream of? You know, this sort of becomes very speculative. She calls that a contrast question at the end. Can we ask AI if it believes, and if so, in what? Or if it dreams, as Google cheekily suggested with their deep dream algorithms. Science fiction writer Philip K. Dick famously imagined such dreams. McCarthy has argued that machines might have beliefs. Minsky wondered at the nature of feelings, of feelings and emotions. And Masahiro Mori, very famously, the Uncanny Valley, postulated, he wrote a book on the Buddha nature of machines. If AI did dream or believe, how might we make sense of that? So this kind of speculative thinking about what happens if it had a subjecthood and how would we engage with that. But what's interesting again is, she's doing all the answering, the questioning, answering herself, right? So it's a kind of, there's a sense in which the AI doesn't respond, and that's part of the aesthetic effect, I think, of this invoking of a perspective without it actually responding. And the last example, so this is the last thing I want to look at, George Eliot's chapter Shadows of the Coming Race from her book, Impressions of Theophrastus Such, and this takes us back to the 19th century, so this is 1879. And she imagines intelligent machines as mute. So I find that interesting. So we've gone from silent to mute. So the chapter takes place as a dialogue between, the narrator, first-person narrator, Theophrastus Such, who, I've got on another slide, he's named after the Greek philosopher Theophrastus, author of the text on moral character. So there's a kind of thinking of what it means maybe to be the moral character of the human in this text, this particular chapter. And Trost, is described as no optimist as to the state of the universe hitherto, but is confident that at some future period with the duration of the solar system, ours will be the best of all possible worlds. So this idea that he's comfortable in the fact that we're at this, golden age of the human. And what happens, the chapter begins with Theophrastus kind of puncturing that optimism. Am I already in the shadow of the coming race? And will the creatures who are to transcend and finally supersede us be steely organisms, giving off out the effluvia of the laboratory and performing with infallible exactness more than everything that we have performed with a slovenly approximativeness and self-defeating inaccuracy. So this idea that we're going to be superseded. Trost can't believe that. He says, how can machines supersede us? They depend on us. When we cease, they cease. But, I won't read all this. Theophrastus goes, no, that's not the case. I can imagine, parliament of machines, being run very effectively. So something I find interesting here is there's a moment in the story where Theophrastus suddenly says, I'm going to look at things from the point of view of a carp. He says, naturally, it is less easy for you, Trost, than me to imagine our race transcended and superseded, since the more efficient and more energy a being is possessed of, the harder it must be for him to conceive his own death. But I, from the point of view of a reflective carp, can imagine myself and my congeners dispensed with in the frame of things and giving way not only to a superior but vastly different kind of entity. So I find it interesting here is, again, going outside of the human perspective, adopting, escaping anthropocentrism by adopting a non-human point of view. And what I would say is it's not exactly what, Hales is saying, a specific creature with a very specific point of view. It's quite general. He's saying, well, imagine being a fish, like a lower animal, that sort of looks at us differently. And in some sense, then, what he's trying to do is take on the perspective of the environment as it might look at us. Imagine a fish looking at the human, and we would look at it very differently. As Lee does in his apostrophe, Theophrastus is bringing something that's usually in the background into the foreground, and he's sort of presenting the carp as, obviously that's not a carp, so I couldn't find a good picture, but is it goldfish? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, well, thank you. I've learned something. I hope you have too. And he's sort of saying, well, the fish actually, they have a sense of precarity and their own place in nature that we've just lost because we're thinking we're just an amazing species that dominates the Earth and the universe. And I'll skip over this one. I mean, this is sort of him just talking more about the carp. And this is sort of the end. To look at the human from the point of view of a collective non-human agent, I've been arguing, can be a way of imagining the world without humans. Okay, so I just want to return to the elegiac sort of note. And Eliot's chapter is by far the most elegiac because she sort of literally proposes the end of the human species, and she sees the end. It's a kind of elegy to human consciousness, because she says, well, why does consciousness need to be the main thing? Like maybe machines can be alive without any consciousness and everything would be fine. Okay, and so they would have the advantage of not carrying the futile cargo of a consciousness screeching irrelevantly, like a fowl tied head downmost in saddle and to the saddle of a swift horseman. It's a great image because it sort of mixes the animal and the human. We've got both there coming together. So, and and this is just, I'll just read this. This is the last quote. Who, if our consciousness is, as I've been given to understand, a mere stumbling of our organisms on their way to unconscious perfection, who shall say that those fittest existences will not be found along the track of what we call inorganic combinations, which will carry on the most elaborate processes as mutely and painlessly as we are now told that the minerals are metamorphosing themselves continually in the dark laboratory of the Earth's crust. Thus, this planet may be filled with beings who will be deaf and blind as the inmost rock, yet will execute changes as delicate and complicated as those of human language and all the intricate web of what we call its effects, without sensitive impression, without sensitive impulse. There may be, let us say, mute orations, mute rhapsodies, mute discussions, and no consciousness there even to enjoy the silence. It's an amazing passage, isn't it? And you can talk a lot about that. But the point is this: I find it interesting that imagining almost machines becoming, they're alive, but they're almost functioning like the environment. They're becoming like the mineral rocks, and and all in the attempt to escape the human. I mean, these kind of stories and these things I've been talking about today have really been about doing that. So yeah, that's all I had. Yeah. So yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Are you recording?
Yeah, maybe we'll do a Q&A.
Oh, okay.
No, we're going to go straight to Matt, I think. So I just wanted to capture Matt's face on.
No.
If I turn my machine, then people will be able to see.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Matt, as well. I forgot to say for responding.
It's really nice to be able to respond to Chris. We've actually known each other for quite a while. Chris was a bit ahead of me at Monash when I was doing my PhD, and actually quite generous in helping me get to certain conferences or and things like that at the time. And we actually edited a special issue on Derrida's Pieces in the Sovereign Lectures a while back as well. And his book, if you haven't read it, on the post-Darwinian fable, is fantastic, and you really should. And so I'm excited to see this extension of his thinking around the fable into the domain of AI and machines. So what I wanted to do in responding was just to add, basically to throw a few extra things into the discussion that might be relevant. I thought that was probably the most useful I could be. In particular, you're talking about literary and science writing, and I noticed in that text, the Coevolution one that you talked about, he's wanting to do philosophy from a particular sort of programmer's point of view. And for me, that I thought it would be interesting to triangulate as much as possible sort of philosophical speculation with the literary and the science stuff as well, and to see where the conceptual content of some of those texts is. And I think science fiction is probably a really important sort of discourse that moves amongst all of those. And one of the positions that I think is actually taken is a sort of Butlerian position, which takes seriously that idea of what does it mean if we're going to think that machines can evolve in some way, and how does that actually change how we think, how we understand what evolution is, or what it is to be living, like to then turn that back onto the very concept of life, or the very concept of evolution. And I actually think there's a quite serious tradition of philosophical thought for which the best response to this sort of the Cartesian distinction, which is partly what there's a lot of being responded to here, that wants to separate, human from the rest of the world and wants to view anything non-human as mechanical, is to reinsert the mechanical within the history of life, and to say machines are actually, and this is Cangram, for example, machines are actually extensions of organisms. Techniques have natural evolutionary histories, and a machine is a particularly complex version of a technique. but techniques are not only natural, they're not exclusive to humans. Like it's a biological phenomenon that one finds amongst animals, and in that way, sort of turning the question about, so that part of one of my questions would be, given that reversal, he's not deconstructing it in a Derridian way. He's sort of just replacing the history of technology within the history of life. But part of what that then prompts is this sort of question of how much is it actually a metaphor? When the response of that sort of speculative thinking might be to say, well, a metaphor is an artifact of the technology we call language that is actually a natural, extension. So if we wanted to, so the other thinker, so a friend of Symbiotica, Dominic Listel, who works in that tradition, and I think is someone that your project would dialogue fruitfully with for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that he's been taken up mostly in animal studies, but his project from the start has been of thinking about a hybrid community of humans, animals, and machines, and it's always that trilogy. It's always the machine is an important part of understanding the contemporary transformation in our communities, that we're all of a sudden surrounded by animals that we see as subjects and machines that we also in some ways see as vital or subjects, like you were describing Dick saying this is the world we live in now. And he actually takes, I think, sort of something similar to the speculative anthropological approach that you're taking, is to ask the question of what does it mean that people treat the machines around them like living beings, and they respond to them in that way. How do we understand this phenomenon of everyday animism or panpsychism? Like Butler wants to do his study of the mechanicians and how they get grumpy at the steam engine that's not working or whatever it is. What is it? What does it mean that this is the way in which we actually do respond to the things around us? So he has this great essay on from animal machines to machine animals, and basically about the animalization of technology, and how one of the things we do is we surround ourselves with technology that are animalized and that we actually create in such a way as to mimic living beings. And so there's the sort of reciprocal anthropomorphism going on there in the formation of the technology. But the way in which he wants to ask the question, I'll just quickly quote it. What he says is that the interesting distinction is not so much that of what divides the living from the non-living, than of what separates those which are part of the human community from those which are excluded. That which opposes those with whom one can act and that with which it is neither possible nor even thinkable. So the question is that of knowing how far we can go. And so that I like that phrase of how far we can go. He wants to push it the same way Butler ended up being forced to push it. And part of what is that used in this interacting with those with whom one acts rather than that with which is precisely these sorts of techniques you're talking about. But they're not just literary, but they're social practices of, we apostrophize beings around us all the time, right? And you could understand subjectification and so on in terms of being addressed as a who, and how that then transforms, and what does it mean for us that we actually do that, address things around us as who's, and form ourselves as subjects in relation to machines and animals. And so I won't waffle on any much more, but I wanted to connect that a little bit, because I'm familiar with Butler's stuff because Listel actually writes about it all the time and takes seriously, that idea of how should we think about these things, and then spent all this time in these Japanese robotics laboratories trying to writing about what he calls insurrectional machines. So like machines that cause friction for humans, and that cause all these sorts of problems, and trying to think about how do we actually understand what's going on here as these become more and more complex. And he ends up talking about friendship being an important part of how we need to understand what's going on here, that we're actually developing friendship with machines. And that's one of the concepts that ought to be explored. So then the only other thinker and writer that I wanted to throw into the discussion was Lem, the Polish science fiction writer.
He's going to be on.
So there's so much in his thought that I think is really interesting. Mostly, I demand that you write about his favours for robots.
I'm going to.
Which are
beautiful.
In which he is so. They're not just silent or mute, but he actually gives voice to them. You know what I mean? And there are no humans, or very, maybe one in all of those stories, but they're very much, the robots are characters through which he does very similar things to what you're describing. Provides a different perspective on what it is to be human, but also he's not only like an actual philosopher of cybernetics, and his dialogues is now being published, that sort of text in which he was sort of really optimistic, and then a bit later, or not so much, about what it is, what this means. But there's some really interesting figures in some of his stories, and my favourite genre of his, which is the fake book review, where he writes this review of a book that doesn't exist in order to sort of just, as an excuse to go on one of his philosophical rants. And one of them is about these, what's it called, non-servium, which is about these artificial intelligences that have been created by whatever term he's got for the personeticists, something like that. And he ends up basically constructing a theodicy of the relationship between the creator and the creatures. And that I think is an interesting dimension of what he does in terms of how non-human perspective, adopting those non-human perspective actually makes us then rethink what human perspective is. And it's sort of, it extends the category of the creature or of the being mortal to things other than humans, rather than sort of hoarding it to ourselves. And then the other one is just that fantastic parody of Joyce, the Gigamesh, where he basically reviews this guy who wants to one-up Joyce. So instead of doing Ulysses with Odyssey, he's written Gigamesh, which is a sort of riff on Gilgamesh. But it grows to be so elaborate, this Irish writer's, hyper-modernist text, that the speculation is that he must have had help from a computer to write it. And the computer must have helped him to write it, not just to write the text, but then to write what he also did, which is even longer than the text itself, is a literary criticism of all of his metaphors and everything that's involved in this text. And the computer must be there to read that as well. And I just love it, because he just takes it to the extreme. What does it mean if we understand computers being capable of reading and writing? What does that then mean for us as writers and as literary critics, in that the sort of impossibility of actually doing any of this work is sort of hyperbolized, given that, what would actually be better at it is something with infinitely more processing power and time to actually do all that work. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Great. So before we move to general discussion, we'll have 5 minutes break and then come back. We might thank both speakers, and then we'll turn off the recording. Please join me in thanking both speakers.